Wow. Are we good? Okay. Hello and welcome to the current episode of our YouTube channel, Unboxing Russia. My name is Pradnya, and together with Ekaterina Schulmann, we are here to unbox a lot of interesting and fascinating topics concerning Russia and India. So before we get into that, wishing all of you a lovely, happy new year. Hope you guys started well in the new year, despite all the doom and gloom wherever one looks. But yeah.
So welcome back. I'm glad we're here. I hope the audience is getting back on track as well. This is the first episode of 2025, and we decided to concentrate not on the plethora of news items littering our news feeds and so our brains, but on the fundamental factors underlying whatever happens in the political world or more broadly in the social world. We want to talk about demography. I would call it my second favorite social science after political science. I also love criminology. It tells you a lot about any given society, but demography is the mother of social sciences because it tells you where people come from. And, you know, society consists of people, and social processes as well as political happen to, well, people. So, demography has recently become something of an obsession for political leadership of various countries. What they are concerned with, what they very much talk about, is increasing birth rates, increasing fertility rates, or in better cases, I would say in more advanced cases, making people live longer. That is extending life expectancy and also making people active for longer, which is interesting because until, I would say quite recently, the concern was rather overpopulation than depopulation. So with all the support for a healthy family and a family with children, governments and countries were rather anxious that fertility rates are too high. We know that in autocratic or even totalitarian countries like China, quite severe, I would say, inhuman measures were taken to limit fertility.
India did that too.
Yeah, the policy of one child per family. Did you have that too?
We didn't have the one child policy, but there were forced sterilizations.
Of specific groups or generally?
Generally, I think I would say. To be fair, I have not delved too deep into that conversation, but it's certainly had severe repercussions for the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi because it was her son who was at the forefront of leading these campaigns.
So at that time, you also had policies aiming to, I would say, forcefully limiting people's fertility fancies. Well, so that was the scare of the 19th and of most of the 20th century, overpopulation, the so-called Malthusian trap. Malthus was the Victorian era English priest. Actually, he dealt with statistics. And he created a mathematical model which showed that if humanity increased at the rates it did increase at his time, it would quite soon overpopulate the earth, eat all the grass, and then breathe in all the air. So something needed to be done about it. Because he was a priest, he was a member of the clergy, he put a moral aspect into all this. His logic was the following. The moment people have a bit more to eat, their lives become just a little bit more prosperous. Instead of devoting that surplus to improving themselves spiritually, they start multiplying, like rabbits. So that's very Victorian, because the whole thing is actually sinful. And if you people were again, spiritually better, you wouldn't be doing these naughty things. But generally, he lived, as I said, in Victorian era, which was the time of the so-called first demographic transition. The first demographic transition is the period, the epoch, I would say, when you have slightly lower death rates and you also have higher birth rates. So in a traditional society and an agrarian society, the numbers of people, the amount of population is regulated as naturally as with the amount of the animal population. So if you have an increase, then next year you'll have hunger or plague or war, and then your numbers will go back to their original level. So this is how humanity lived for many, many ages until it learned to produce more food than it immediately needed, and also when it learned to more or less combat infectious diseases. So with urbanization, with a certain degree of success of medicine and generally hygiene, people started to have more children who died at less high rates. So this is the first demographic transition. This is the period of rapid increase of the world population. And actually, there is a term youth bulge, which is the position where in your demographic pyramid you have these bricks which signify people from 15 to 25, larger or rather longer than the rest of the bricks composing your pyramid. So you have more young people than people of other ages. And demographers generally say that youth bulge correlates to higher levels of aggression, both internal and external. So European countries at that moment had more people than they could feed. England was the country with the birth rate of about 6 children per woman, which is unimaginable for us. So how did the first world of that time dealt with this surplus population? A lot of them were exported to the colonies. So people who couldn't get jobs, food, who couldn't marry, both men and women, they went to the colonies. And one might say that the surplus population was burned during the 2 world wars. This is especially true for Russia, because it also had a rapid increase in the 19th and early 20th century. It was an agrarian country with high birth rates. So if you don't starve or kill your agrarian population, it starts to multiply. And we all know, well, the Russians know the calculations of some of our famous scientists, like the chemistry classic Dmitry Mendeleev, the one who composed the periodical table. He was also interested in demography, and he calculated a prediction which had Russia achieve about 300 million people, but by the middle of the 20th century. So if things went at that rate, Russia, the Russian Empire, of course, of that time would have been rather like United States. Of course, nothing of this kind happened. We didn't even have half of this population because of the catacombs of the first half of the century.
I'm just looking very skeptically the whole time, because we're talking about, we started talking about the population growth and all of that in the beginning of the 20th century. And of course, advancement of medicine and all of that. But the one thought kept coming to my mind, that this was a privilege of the West. This was a privilege of the Europeans, of the Americans, potentially even countries like Russia, who had a fair amount of power. But it certainly was not the case in the case of the colonies, because in a lot of those places, either there was no access to good medicine, or there were man-created famines, which the British, for instance, in India, they did that in West Bengal, for instance.
They did it a couple of times.
So there was also
tremendous results.
Ethnic cleansing in a way.
But did not the population of India increase during that time?
Post-independence. Because I think, so to be fair, I think a lot of Indians also did not have the choice to decide if they wanted to fight the war. It was the British war effort, and the British war effort meant you have...
You mean the Second World War?
The Second World War, also the first one. So wherever the crown goes, the slaves go too. And the colonies,
so they were drafted whether they wanted or not.
They didn't really have a choice. So when you talk about deleting of surplus populations, an element of it is also coming from the colonies and not just the white surplus population. So just, because that's something that often is, then it goes down in broader conversations, because a lot of data available from that point of time is focusing largely on certain parts of the world. There is very less data available from the African colonies, from the Asian colonies, pertaining to that particular period. And, helping us to establish those connections between advancement of medicine, arrival of industrialization in some parts.
Yes.
But the data is not there because no one was interested.
That is right. But the global demographic trends are supposed to be, global and to affect all the countries. So you see, despite all that, after India achieved independence, it also started to experience population growth.
It did.
But as well as other parts of the world, by the end of the 20th century, and especially in the first quarter of the 21st century, does it not strike you as weird that we have already lived through 1/4 of the 21st century?
Yeah.
You remember how we said 21st century as a synonym for something that is so far in the future?
Yeah. Yeah, I still remember the Y2K obsession. The last evening of 1999 with the whole big question of tomorrow if the computers will spring to life.
Computers were already so
and
important
stock exchanges will completely crash. I think there was just so much of mistrust and people were so concerned. So it seems like a long, long time ago. It also makes me feel very old.
One could already write the history of mass panics of the 21st century.
And there are not few.
All right, let's come back. Let's come back to the solid demographic data. So what happened in the 21st century is what some demographers call the second demographic transition. Some don't like the term and say that it's all part of the first demographic transition. But if we use it, what does it mean? What does the second demographic term means? It describes a situation where you have lower birth rates, higher average life expectancy. You have higher ages at which people become parents, both men and women. You have lower maternity and infant death rates. So you have fewer children, but almost all of them survive. You have them later in life because women get education. Egoistic creatures, rather than giving birth whenever they can. And you also live longer and you can work for longer because of the further successes of medicine, but mainly, again, I think because of the successes of urban hygiene. So, and also vaccination. Vaccination made a tremendous impact on the mortality rates, infant and children's, and maternity mortality rates as well. So this is your second demographic transition. And when and wherever it was in full swing, the governments and, the nations, the people themselves, started to get anxious in the anti-Malthusian way, being afraid of lower birth rates and therefore the world depopulation.
Populations are not in a place to replace.
Yes. So if your country's fertility rate, that is the average number of children per woman, the average number of children an average woman has in her lifetime, gets below 2, which is known as replacement level, of course, because if you have 2 parents and they're going to die, we're all going to die, unfortunately. So for them to be replaced, they need to have 2 children. And if you drop below the replacement level, then you start getting scared that your population is dwindling. And this brings with it all sorts of problems, real or imagined. The imagined part is, of course, easy to understand. Fertility, life and death and birth are highly mythologized categories. We care about it. This is something that is essential to basic human experience. And it is also something, the control over which is extremely important for political power. There is a term biopolitics, which means the set of measures or attempts at measures that the states take in order to influence the way people procreate. There's also a less nice term, necropolitics, which means policy for dealing out death. It may sound more dark than it should, but part of necropolitics is, for example, deciding in which order do you provide medical assistance to various groups of people.
There's a prioritization.
Yes, prioritization. Basically, you decide who should not be allowed to die and who should, in case you don't have enough resources for your help to
But that's
reach
standard
everyone.
practice in hospitals, no?
Yes, that's why I'm explaining it, so that it doesn't sound like necropolitics is only about building concentration camps and doing ethnic cleansing. It is not always so dire as that, but power over bodies is power per se. So if you can get that, then you are truly powerful. Therefore, almost every politician out there talks about children and mothers and supporting families and core values, etc. That's why questions of gender equality or inequality, questions of sex behavior are so toxic and at the same time, well, so exciting. Toxicity is part of the excitement politically. So,
but why is it becoming so relevant now?
In Russia, it has recently become indeed something of an obsession. How recent, and why am I calling it an obsession? Soviet Union had more or less the same demographic dynamics as the rest of our world, specifically Central and Eastern Europe. It was not unique in that respect. It experienced in the second half of the century when Russia stopped being an agrarian country. And that happened after the Second World War, when around the beginning of the 60s, urban population exceeded country population. So we became an urbanized society. And the process has gone on since then. We are not just an urbanized country, we are the country of hyper-concentration.
Yeah.
For various reasons, because of centralization, because of the planned economy, because we are a large country with a nasty climate and then not so good roads, people tend to concentrate in certain places. So we have more cities with population over 100,000 people than per
I think your
person
density is one of the lowest
Europe.
across the world. The population density in Russia is one of the lowest in the world.
Yes, it is.
It's
but
2 point something,
but
which is
the
very
population
less.
density in our cities,
Yeah. I'm just saying, on an average, it gets flattened out.
We are a country with spots of high density population, and in between there's emptiness and bad roads. Well, roads did become better recently, to be fair, but still, my point is we are an over-concentrated society, and we have those areas where people congregate. The most important of this is the capital and its agglomeration, the second capital, St. Petersburg, and its agglomeration, and also the southern Russia, the Black Sea coast.
But when you talk about population concentration, I think it's all relative, as they say. So just to put it in perspective, so India, for instance, is 2.4% of the world's land, and it hosts 1.16 of the world population. So every sixth person on the face of this earth lives in India. And the population density in India, because we're talking about concentrations, it's about 480 people per square kilometer. So it's a small
impressive.
part of the world, 2.1%, and has the burden of a huge chunk of the population.
You have much nicer climate. Russia is full of places
No, I
where
don't think
people
it's just
can't live.
it's just
We're
the
not
climate.
supposed
I think
to.
there are multiple factors that contributed, but we'll come to that. And Russia, on the other side, looking at the extremes, of 2 people per square kilometer to what you just mentioned, it averages out about at 8. That's 8 people per square kilometer. So, there is a difference of about 400.
So again, let's
60.
repeat. We Russia have 8 people per square kilometer
roughly.
on the average. And you?
480.
480. Yes.
So that's what I meant. It's all relative. Of course, if you look at the urban-rural divide and all of that, that's a whole rabbit hole. We can choose to go down it or not. But I'm just saying that, when you look at it from different lenses, because numbers are numbers. It depends on the context you put them in.
Yes, you're right.
So going back to the obsession.
480, yeah, going back to the obsession. So, the curse of the late Soviet Union was not so much low birth rates. Again, they were no lower than in other relatable places of the earth, but early mortality, and specifically early male mortality, which was and remains tied to such negative social traits as alcoholism, violent crime, road accidents with fatal consequences, suicide rates. We, at that moment, have the gap in average life expectancy between males and females at 12 years. All the successes, the much publicized successes of our demographic policies of recent times in increasing life expectancy is because of the women, not of the men. So, coming back to the Soviet Union, when it collapsed, we entered a rather deep demographic gap of the 90s, which was not fully due to the instability and poverty of the 90s, but we have those gaps every 25 years.
So I have a technical question. When you say that the 90s saw a huge dip in the population, was it also partly because of the inter-Soviet space migration? You know, because then suddenly once the Iron Curtain came down, I think a lot of republics suddenly found their own footing and they became independent, for lack of a better word. And I'm also sure that that also led to a lot of redivision. And reallocation of resources, including populations.
You are absolutely right. So, again, we have those gaps every 25 years because of the demographic losses of the first half of the 20th century, specifically of the Second World War. So a population that was killed off produced less children, and when these children become parents, they also produce less children. But the 90s, of course, kind of increased that tendency, which ought to have become less and less pronounced with every passing generation, but it did not, because again, people didn't want to have children in the unstable situation they found themselves in. But about the redistribution of population, you're right. When the Soviet Union went down and the former Soviet socialist republics became independent, they started to build their own national identities as nation states, and that meant the expulsion, in some cases more violent, in some cases less so, of the Russian ethnic population. So the chief demographic trend of the 90s and early years of the 21st century was the re-migration of the Russian ethnic population from the republics of Soviet Union back to Russia, to Russian Federation. This I can say it compensated for the low birth rates of that time, because what the economy needed then was not infants, but workers. So it more than compensated for the loss, because it gave to the economy instant injection of capable and Russian-speaking workforce. But then this population present, I would say, the free gift, was absorbed. We came face to face with the consequences of this birth gap, I would say, this population gap. And when economic situation became slightly better, the government bestirred itself and started caring about demography. The solution, which was produced in the middle of the 0 years, was the so-called maternity capital. One of the very few really successful and well thought through measures ever taken by a post-Soviet government in Russia. A maternity capital is a certain sum of money, fairly large and increasing with regular indexations, which are paid to a woman who gives birth to her second or third or next child. It is not paid in cash, and you cannot cash it, but you could and can spend it on a number of things. You can invest it in real estate. You can buy an apartment or invest in a house. You can spend it on your own education, or you can save it for your children's education. And it belongs solely to a woman.
To the mother.
Yes, to the mother, hence the name maternity capital. So, because of the maternity capital, the general stabilization of the economy, people's increasing income levels, and also the feeling of stability and growing prosperity, which is more effective than prosperity per se, the sense that tomorrow will be better than today.
The sense of security.
The sense not just of security for the moment.
No, but like a security in terms of planning.
Yes. So people could plan ahead. And to this constellation of circumstances, we owe the so-called golden Putin years, the 10 years of relatively high birth rates. Again, relatively.
Which time was this?
This was 2006 to 2016. Almost exactly 10 years. Some demographers put it at 2004, 2014. Why this may be important? Because the trend stopped and then made a U-turn. Why did that happen? People's disposable incomes stopped increasing after 2013. And the Crimean adventure, although it was met with enthusiasm, and to this time it remains an approved step of the government, of the president, it gave the people the feeling that while they, again, totally support the whole thing, it is kind of making them nervous at the same time.
Do you also think the economic sanctions put by the West played a role in decreasing the economic prosperity?
The economic sanctions of 2014 and next years were negligible.
So they didn't have so much of an impact. And currently,
I'm not an economist, but I don't think they had an impact before 2022.
Okay.
So that was a kind of the first blow dealt by that very same government to the processes that it put so much effort into fostering, which is kind of ironic. In 2016, seeing that the effectiveness of the maternity capital program is not what it used to be, they made another step, which some demographers think was disastrous. They transferred the maternity capital to the first child. So previously it was just for the second and posterior children. But then they decided to pay for the first child as well. Demographers with the characteristic cynicism say that you, the state, you don't have to purchase the first child. People will have it anyway. Having a child is supposed to be part of basic human experience. So whether you are poor or not, if you are not disastrously poor, you will try to, get yourself married and to have at least one child. So if you need to increase your country's birth rates, then pay for the second and the third and the next child. So I do think that this specific factor that I'm describing right now may be exaggerated. Its influence may be exaggerated by the demographers because all professionals see their own part of the question. I think people just stopped feeling the stability. They stopped believing that tomorrow will be better than today. Or maybe other factors struck in. Some social scientists think that the advent of social media and general of gadgets lowers birth rates because people have more interesting things to do than procreating. It kind of atomizes societies. And it may not be an accident that by 2016, the use of internet in Russia was universally widespread. And the number of people who use internet daily increased the number of people who use TV daily. That was a kind of
switch.
A switch, yes. A minor at first, but important and with tremendous consequences, not just for the demography, but I think it impacted demography as well. So in this way, we kind of hobbled through till 2020, till the COVID. And then COVID came. Russia had some of the largest surplus mortality during pandemic among developed countries. We at first, we did introduce pretty severe quarantine measures, but we failed to do a properly all-permitting vaccination campaign. The levels of distrust were already high. People were afraid of COVID and they were afraid of the vaccine as well. And those who planned pregnancy delayed it because of the fear of the consequences, both of COVID and of vaccination.
And then 22 happened.
And then 22 happened. I think that with proper political and economic management, if the pandemic ended and war didn't start, we could have, again, to use the same term, hobbled out of this situation. I don't think that properly high birth rates are achievable in an industrialized, educated society, but we could opt for non-dramatic decline of our birth rates. And by the way, when we are talking about lower and higher, what exactly do we mean? So we have currently a fertility rate of, again, average number of children per woman of 1.43, which is higher than the average European rate, being 1.39. So 43,
You're talking about the
39.
birth rate or?
I'm talking about fertility rate, birth rate. Yes,
rate, okay.
yes. In United States, it's higher. It's 1.62. United States is pretty unique among developed and rich countries. They have high birth rates, partly because of their diverse ethnic composition. There are two other exceptions to the rule that when your society gets educated, you have less children. These two exceptions being Israel. Some would say this is because of the ultra-religious groups, but they generally have a high birth rate. And Kazakhstan. These are countries which are, again, relatively rich, relatively educated, literacy rates are high. In Israel, rates of education are the highest in the world in terms of percentage of people with education higher than the secondary. This is the first country in the world in this respect. Canada is the second. Russia, are the third. So a lot of people choose to be educated after they finish school. So these are the exceptions, but generally, this is the rule. The strangest thing in this whole second demographic transition story is that the lowest birth rates of today are not in the richest European countries, but in Southeastern Asia, in China. They were so successful with the one child per family policy that when they ceded this policy, it was already too late.
I don't think I even need to look so far as China. I think I can just talk about India.
Yeah,
because
but in 2023, India became the largest country in the world in terms of population. And I think that during our lifetime, whether it will be long or short, we will see it remain so. China will never, in foreseeable future,
because of the youth bulge. We are in that phase right now.
So why are you different from China, South Korea, Japan, which are some of the oldest society in the world with lowest birth rates?
How do you mean different?
Why have you outrun China in this?
So the thing is, I think a lot of people, so when we talk about youth bulge, we are looking at the population bracket of 15 to 64, which is
again 15 to
64,
which strikes me as a young age.
No, but which is a working population. These are people who can contribute in terms of GDP. So for productivity's sake, it's considered a youth bulge if you have that much amount of the population in the workforce. And so a lot of people who are now in this bracket were born in the mid-80s, early 90s, which is my generation. We cannot forget that in the beginning of early 90s, India went through a massive liberalization of the economy. So suddenly there were far too many opportunities. The prosperity started growing slowly and steadily. So I think that there was this time frame where a lot of people planned to have children because historically, generationally, because of whatever backgrounds they were coming from, they probably did not have the economic prosperity to sustain those family structures, to have many children or to have even two children. And if you had a child, you were producing a child with the rationale that you will have more people to work for you. You wanted more hands on the ground earning more money. So it wasn't really coming from a place of privilege. Quite rather the opposite. You wanted more hands on the deck to earn more money. And so just to put it in terms of referencing, population growth rate in India from 1972 to 1983 was at 2.3%. And now in 2017, which was the last time when they calculated it, was around 0.98. So you see a massive dip. But what the challenge right now is, a big part of that population is now working. They are young people. They are in this age bracket that I mentioned. And of course, the generations that came before them, which was this 2.3% bracket generation, they were the ones who ended up having kids, whose kids are now coming in that age bracket as well. So which means that...
So you're in for another increase.
Yeah.
But now you have a slight decline.
We have a decline, and it's been also very stable. Like the fertility rate, it hasn't really significantly changed.
What is it now?
At the moment, in India, it is 1.98 children.
So it's below replacement level,
Slightly
but it's
below.
higher, not just than Russia, of course.
Also
everyone is
higher than
Russia.
Germany.
It's higher than United States.
Yeah. So I think we are at the replacement level, but I think we cannot keep up with that, because I think a lot of other factors now start playing in. You have urbanization, you have infrastructural issues, because there's, like I mentioned at the beginning, 2.4% of the world's land, and sustaining a population of about 1/6 of the world's population.
So is your political sphere, is your government, generally speaking, concerned with overpopulation or depopulation?
I don't think they're concerned so much with overpopulation, because they can't really do much about it. They have to deal with it. And one of the ways they're also trying to deal with it is also supporting people who want to move out, who want to migrate to different countries. So you have a lot of these mobility agreements. Because even with a decent growth rate, decent is again a very subtle way to put it, 6 to 7% growth rate in an economy right now is something to dream of.
Yes.
And India has sustained that for the past few years. So even at that growth rate, it is impossible to create those many job opportunities for the workforce.
So you still have more people than you have jobs.
We have 67.5% of the Indian population, which is 1.4 billion people in the workforce. So you cannot potentially be creating so many jobs to absorb that workload. So
in Russia, it's an exactly opposite.
Yeah, but
there's a labor deficit in all the spheres of the economy.
So I'm sure that whatever government is in power, regardless of their political affiliations, it is a concern. And you can see it when it comes to infrastructure. The burden on the infrastructure is massive. The way cities are growing, the way you also need to keep up with housing. Because opportunities are concentrated in and around cities. So you have the semi-urban and the urban spaces. Even then, the agricultural, so to just put it in context, I think urbanization in India at today's rate, only 36% of the Indian population lives in urban spaces.
36.
So you can imagine how
we have
vast.
About 75.
Yeah, so you can still imagine that 1/3 or a little over 2/3 of Indian population still lives in urban, in rural and semi-rural areas.
And there the birth rates are higher than in the cities, or is it the other way around?
I would not really differentiate so much on that, because I think what is a good marker for me personally is that of sex ratios. Because India for the longest time, we had a very big problem with sex ratio. We had far too many women compared to 1,000 men. So sex ratio is this one.
Why did that happen?
So,
usually overall, you have more boys born than girls.
Usually you do, but I think that for
do
the population to
die
have a
off later.
No,
what
for the population
to
have a healthy proportion amongst itself, you should have a surplus. Not a surplus, but you should have the ratio somewhere 900 plus 930, 940 per 1,000 males. So that's a healthy marker. In India, having a girl child was usually, still is in some parts of India, considered a burden. Because you pay
like
a dowry.
in China, it led to selective infanticide or selective
Exactly,
abortions,
India,
and now they have so much more males than females that it became a problem.
I think in India, female infanticide is to an extent still an issue. I would not say it's not there, but it's gotten better. So I think India has worked really hard on addressing the issue of sex ratio. So for me, I don't like to look at it, at least I did not bother to look at it to also own up to my ignorance. I was happy when I saw the sex ratio stabilizing. So the sex ratio in India right now has stabilized to about 945 females, roughly.
Per thousand.
4,000 males.
Per
and in extremely well-doing parts of India, it's a little higher, which is a good sign to have at least a balanced out population. But going back to the whole conversation about pressure of population on a government. So I think those pressures are becoming extremely evident. Like I said, you cannot absorb that amount of workforce into the job market. So they are happy to, also support people who want to move out. You should lend some of them to Russia. Oh, we are trying. Some of them are on your fronts with Ukraine.
That's not what I meant.
The wrong part, I know. But so a lot of them are now intending to come to Europe because Germany, for instance, entered into massive agreements with the Indians to facilitate an easier
The
arrival.
Indian diaspora in the States statistically is the richest among diasporas. And it also has the highest medium income, highest levels of education, lowest levels of divorce. You don't divorce.
In Germany as well. The highest, one of the groups with highest median level of income is the Indians. It's the Indian Germans.
So you're good people to have around.
Yeah, I would like to believe that. But yeah, so I think...
So about policies. Generally, there's some sort of correlation between talking about protecting the family, supporting people who have more children, and I wouldn't say authoritarian trend, but something that looks suspiciously like it. So autocrats and budding autocrats, they love to talk about traditional families and women having a lot of children with a kind of understanding behind it that it's better for them to stay at home and procreate rather than educate themselves and then hunt for jobs. So do you have this conversation? Do you have this public agenda, this official discourse in India?
So this is again a very slippery slope, and I'm going to try to tread it very carefully because if you look at the population growth rates, so in India, when you look at the population, you also look at their religious
groups, subgroups,
the subgroups as well as the caste subgroups.
So who has more children, the rich or the poor?
So I'm talking about the religion part of it right now, not so much of the class, because the religion is the key part right now, which is a part of the popular discourse. So right now, the data available to us is from the 2011 census.
So that was your last census?
We did not do a 21 census because of the pandemic.
We did it at that year and we flopped it completely. So specialists don't use it, the results of census of 2025. So to put a small note here, an asterisk, we don't really know how many people live in Russia.
Yeah.
Not just because our borders are so fluid and are possibly going to become even more fluid in the next few weeks, but because we have this sacred figure of 142 million people, which has not changed since I was born, and this cannot be true. So there's really a very intense professional discussion among experts as to how many people
or you figured out the exact formula of replacement population rates.
Well. Some people think, again, some experts, some demographers suppose that we really have 130, and some say 110. And this is, again, it's so demeaning to even have this kind of discussion, like we're talking about an Assyrian empire, not about our own days when everything is being digitalized and our every move is being recorded. And yet we cannot say how many people live where, because the heads of the regions have an incentive in creating a false impression as to the numbers, because they get budgetary financing per capita. So the more capitas, the more heads they show, even if it's just on paper, the more money they get. Statistics from the Northern Caucasian republics is never referred to in polite conversation because it's supposed to have no connection to the reality on the ground whatsoever. The maternity capital that I mentioned with so much praise was used there in those territories to, again, produce children that never existed. so that you could get the money. And also, people don't die there because they continue to receive pensions. So at the same time, it is supposed that there are, if not a lot, well, sizable amounts of people who are not registered anywhere, like religious communities, various sects who occupy, well, little visited plots of land, and they have no passports, no registration on state digital platforms,
so they don't exist technically.
They technically they don't exist, while we have other people who exist technically while not existing physically. And to add to this, we have the imaginary territories of the Russian Federation where no one knows if anyone lives at all. So
No, I think
this is the
we like to
position
be rooted more
we
in
discuss
numbers.
ourselves in. Yeah, let's move to India.
So
Which is the land of realities rather than wild imaginations of your political leadership.
no, so the problem is our last census was in 2011, and according to that census, the population, Hindu population of the Indian subcontinent or India was about 80% at that point. And the Muslim population was somewhere around 14%, give or take a few. The religious growth aspect of it, so the population growth rate according to religion at that point between 2001 and 2011 was pegged at the Hindu population grew at 16.8, while the Muslim population grew at 24.6. But again, like I said, this is a very, very tricky and a very slippery slope. So one has to tread it with caution without, fueling further conspiracy theories, which a lot of people do right now in India, because we don't have current numbers since 2011.
That's a long time ago.
We cannot really put a finger and say, see, that community, they are like procreating like bunnies. And our population is dying out. So, this grand replacement theory, that is very popular in Europe as well.
Who will outbirth whom?
And I think that has somehow become a part of the political narrative now. So when you talk about Hindu versus Muslim divide, now it has also become more bizarre. It's not just the Indian Muslims who are considered to be,
a danger.
There's also this narrative of so many Bangladeshi Muslims coming in and, starting to live here and
So you have your own
procreating.
evil migrants. Well, you play the part of evil migrants to other countries.
We have the evil in popular narrative currently in many parts of India, which is the Muslim community. And then you have the evil of the evil, which is the illegal migrant Muslim.
So illegal migration is an issue with you as well.
It is. I would not say it is not, but I think the way these things are put together, it's a brilliant communication strategy. Like you can give credit where it's due. The impact of it is another story, but it's a brilliant narrative to kind of, make space for votes.
And do you have the official narrative of, again, supporting traditional family, something analogous to our national project family or national project demography?
I don't think there's so much chatter about traditional family, but I will also say that, in my opinion, I think we are right now a very interesting society. So on the one hand, we are people where about 28% of the workforce is female. No. I think from 2013 to 2023, it increased from 27% to 32%.
You have still some way to go.
No, so but this is the organized labor force. In India, like I said, 2/3 of the Indian population still lives in rural India.
So no one counts whether
and
they work or not.
And the unorganized labor force, which is women working on farms. I strongly
suspect.
Who are working in the unorganized sector are still very much a part of the workforce, who don't figure out in this statistics. Point being, we have increasingly this half part of the population, which is increasingly becoming more assertive, trying to claim a space for itself. And on the one hand, you have the resurgence of this extremely conservative, largely patriarchal value systems.
Like everywhere else.
So India is not an exception.
They say.
Exactly. So I think we are now trying to figure out how to navigate that complicated space, because as opposed to a lot of other countries, we also have this challenge that most of these people are also very young. And they are
you do have the youth bulge.
And they are extremely assertive. They are very vocal in the political spaces. So you cannot really just scare them with something and hope that they're going to be scared and stay like that for the rest of their lives.
Which is very much a thing with the Russian population. Russia is an aging society. And in our case, aging means female dominated. In more fortunate countries like United States, the female surplus starts after 60. Well, generally, males die earlier than females. Females live longer. But with us, it starts at 40.
Yeah.
We have a tragically early male mortality. And this is the issue that the government ought to be addressing rather than trying to convince women to have more children.
I was surprised to see that the life expectancy in India is higher than in Russia. For India, the average life expectancy is at 72.03. And for Russia, it's 70.06.
That's because your males don't drink at that rate.
But we also have very, very poor conditions or the way of life.
That's right.
So I think, it kind of adds up because life in India is very hard in a way. I'm not saying it's easier in Russia.
You have nicer climate and better food.
No, but I think we have to, the point I'm trying to make is since the day you're born, life is, it's a struggle, right from getting a place in the kindergarten because nothing is given to you by the state. You have to fight for it.
So you don't have this social benefits network.
Like we have public schools. Your kid could go to it if you wanted.
Do you have governmental measures of assistance for families, for mothers? Payments,
you do, but it's also a very bizarre thing. So
discounts.
In order to to address maternal health issues, for young mothers, they try to incentivize mothers who go to a hospital, a government hospital, and deliver their child there, and you get some money.
Because the tradition is that you stay at home for this.
You would have midwives helping you out. The downside of it was if you are doing your delivery at home, it's very easy to kill your female child.
And that's what people do.
Used to happen. I'm sure it still happens somewhere, but I would like to believe that it has gone down significantly. Now, the problem is the network of hospitals is not so wide. So you've had now cases of women dying on the way to the hospital.
Because they wanted to do the right thing.
And they wanted the money because they're poor women.
Yes.
And this was that one amount of money that could only be handed out to them and not to their husbands or to anyone else.
So you don't have maternity capitals, evidently.
No, but so there was this incentive which was attached to it, which was a sad thing because it was coming from a good place. It meant well, but in terms of execution, it kind of lost its plot, to put it very darkly.
The most recent measure trying to address Russia's demography issues is the one that troubles me because it's based on a bad example of payments for contracts with the Ministry of Defense. Now, for 3 years, Russian regions have been paying increasing sums for males and, women as well, to sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense and go to war. And now analogous measures are planned for making our demography better. The region started to advertise payments for mothers, but not just any mothers, but those women who choose to have children before they're 25 or 23. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to reverse the second demographic transition in lowering the age of having a first child, which is pretty archaic measure. If it will succeed, I think it's dangerous because it will prevent later those women from having proper education and getting a job that they could have had they completed the education. Of course, with proper support and a good family, it is entirely possible to have a child while you're young and then go and study and then go and have a job. But statistically, ironically, there's a correlation between having your first child earlier and it remaining your only child. It is much more likely, again statistically, for a woman who had a child before 25 to choose not to have any more children. The experience is often traumatic. So it happens to poorer families. It happens to poorer females. And it is exactly this strata that could be tempted by one-time payments, because for them the sum seems enormous. So you see, this is one bad thing breeding another bad thing. The Russian government has been buying the poorest, the least educated, the least financially literate to go and get killed. And now they're trying to
technically buying them off.
By technically buying them like meat. And they're being killed off in enormous rates. And they are thinking that there is no other way for them to earn so much, which is economically true. They could never earn during their whole lifetime of work the same amount of money as the Minister of Defense gets them. But it comes with a lot of drawbacks, even if we rule out the possibility of you being killed, because with the way Russia wages this war, bodies are often left lying on the field, and so you're not technically killed. You are disappeared without a trace, and your family gets nothing. So now they're trying to do the same thing with buying children. So they target the least educated, the most vulnerable, and they tell them, don't finish school, don't go to college, don't go to university, just get pregnant, and then you'll get this fantastic sum like 100,000 rubles, which is nothing. It will dissolve in their hands, and they will be burdened with a child and no education.
I think with the best of intentions, something like this would not work in India, because the cost of living and putting your child through an entire education system and making sure that he or she comes out on the top is such an expensive affair.
Imagine people who do not plan so far ahead, who are fascinating with the money that they can get right now for nothing.
So I don't think still it would make so much of sense for people in India, is my guess, because even if the temporary fascination for the money that you could earn right now is there, you are also aware that your child also wants more. You have an aspiration. You want.
It's good for you if you are aware of things of that kind.
I would like to believe that a broad context of it is. Again, this is a very broad generalization, broad stroke, but yeah.
I think this kind of calculation is for the educated only. This is what strikes me as so diabolically unfair.
But also underrepresented.
Again, targeting the weakest. And this is what the state does, that ought to support the weakest, not lure them into various traps. So, to wrap up, Russia is not dying out. India is not spilling its surplus population to occupy the whole world. Your fertility rate
it in a good way.
Is below replacement level. Our fertility rate is way below replacement level, but it is higher than the average European fertility rates. Our problem really is low life expectancy and early mortality, especially male mortality, and war, as you would guess, doesn't help.
No.
Not at all. And general brutalization of society that encourages typical male behavior, which is killing yourself early and fast and taking some of your neighbors with you to hell, does not contribute positively to this either.
No.
In case of India, you still have this, to me, it sounds pretty huge, agrarian bulge, and large percentage of agrarian population means high birth rates. But you also have disparity in multiplying rates, in increased rates between ethnic and religious groups, which is being exploited politically. Am I right?
Indeed.
Or am I right?
Indeed. You're right, and you're right.
So these are the fundamentals that we are dealing with. Governments need more soldiers. Governments need more labor force.
We have too much of labor force.
You have too much of labor force. We could, form a mutually advantageous union.
My concern is it would be put to wrong use.
Yes, but our government is so evil-minded at the moment that getting in union with us wouldn't benefit anybody.
No.
Hoping this would change, and then we could address actual demographic issues rather than imaginary picture where women have children starting 15, which they won't. The demographic transition is irreversible.
And it's real.
It is. No matter how autocratic you are, No matter how powerful you think yourself, you can't upturn a process which is objectively driven and which is taking decades and which will be here in the next decades as well. On
that very
yes, decisive note,
decisive yet very how do I say, decisive yet very promising slash confusing slash depressing note.
How can something be promising and depressing at the same time?
No, for India it's promising because we have this.
You look pretty good. Again, the picture you painted looks pretty
That's what
healthy.
I meant, but yours was
to
equally
me.
depressing.
Yeah,
So-
we are worse off.
So on that note,
And to our credit be it said that while discussing these fundamental issues, we have not even touched on the
current news.
Expressive and controversial gestures. You know what they always say when someone comes up with a swastika on his forehead? They say it's just an ancient Indian solar symbol.
It is, but it's being misused.
Yes. So it all came from your place.
I would like to believe that, but unfortunately,
You
sitting
don't
in
want-
Berlin, it would be a tall claim to make.
You don't want to take responsibility
No.
for your ancient solar
No,
symbol.
no.
I remember I've seen it in one of the old Victorian, early Edwardian, strictly speaking, a book of Rudyard Kipling's short stories used as an ornament.
Yeah.
Which was, interesting to see.
You
in
will
a
still find
children's
it
book.
outside houses when you go to India or on doors, but don't let that scare you because generally we are nice and hospitable people. So do knock and come in.
Come and visit India. That was your line, actually.
That was my advertisement.
I haven't been there, but I definitely want to.
All right. So thank you so much for joining us today. It was lovely.
And hopefully see you in the next episode.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.